Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. On this week, 16 years ago, the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks published Future Tense, a powerful vision of the future of Judaism, Jewish life, and the state of Israel in the 21st century. 5 years later, he delivered a progress report on that future to AJC Global Forum. On the sidelines of this year's Global Forum, my colleague Meggie Wyschogrod Fredman spoke with two guests from the Rabbi Sacks Legacy, which was established after his death in 2020 to preserve and teach his timeless and universal wisdom.
In 2014, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks addressed our Global Forum stage to offer the State of the Jewish World. Modeled after the U.S. President's State of the Union speech given every year before Congress and the American people, this address was intended to offer an overview of what the Jewish people were experiencing and to look towards our future. The full video is available on AJC's website as well as the Sacks Legacy website. For today's episode, we are holding a crossover between AJC's People of the Pod podcast and Books and Beyond, the Rabbi Sacks podcast. On Books and Beyond, each episode features experts reflecting on particular works from Rabbi Sacks. Channeling that model, we'll be reflecting on Rabbi Sacks' State of the Jewish World here at AJC's 2025 Global Forum in New York. AJC has long taken inspiration from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, and today, AJC and the Rabbi Sacks Legacy have developed a close partnership. To help us understand his insights, I am joined by two esteemed guests. Dr. Tanya White is one of the inaugural scholars and the founder and host of the podcast Books and Beyond, the Rabbi Sacks podcast. Joanna Benarroch is the global chief executive of the Rabbi Sacks Legacy, and prior to that, worked closely with Rabbi Sacks for over 2 decades in the office of the chief rabbi. Joanna, Tanya, thank you for being with us here at AJC's Global Forum.
It's wonderful to be with you, Meggie.
Thank you so much, Meggie.
I want to get to the state of the Jewish world. I vividly remember that address. I was with thousands of people in the room, Jews from different walks of life, Jews from around the globe, as well as a number of non-Jewish leaders and dignitaries. And what was so special is that each of them held on to every single word. He identifies these 3 areas of concern: a resurgence of anti-Semitism in Europe, delegitimization of Israel on the global stage, and the Iranian regime's use of terror and terror proxies towards Israel. This was 2014. So with exception of, I would say, today needing to broaden, unfortunately, anti-Semitism far beyond Europe to the skyrocketing rates we're living through today, it's really remarkable, the foresight and the relevance that these areas he identified hold. What do you think allowed Rabbi Sacks to see and understand these challenges so early, before many in the mainstream did? And how is his framing of anti-Semitism and its associated threats different from others? And I'll let Tanya jump in and start.
So firstly, I think there was something very unique about Rabbi Sacks. You know, very often since he passed, we keep asking the question, how was it that he managed to reach such a broad and diverse audience from non-Jews and even in the Jewish world? You know, you will find Rabbi Sacks's books in a Chabad yeshiva, even a Haredi yeshiva perhaps, and you will find them in a very left liberal Jewish institution. There's something about his works, his writing, that somehow fills a space that many Jews of many denominations and many people, not just Jews, are searching for. And I think this unique synthesis of his knowledge, he was clearly a religious leader, but he wasn't just uniquely a religious leader. He was a scholar of history, of philosophy, of political thought. And the ability to, I think, be able to not just read and have the knowledge, but to integrate the knowledge with what's going on at this moment is something that takes extreme prowess and a very deep sense of moral clarity that Rabbi Sacks had. And I would say more than moral clarity is a moral imagination. I think it was actually Tony Blair. He spoke about the fact that Rabbi Sacks had this ability, this kind of, I think he even used the term moral imagination, that he was able to see something that other people just couldn't see. Professor Berman from University of Bar-Ilan, Joshua Berman, a brilliant Bible scholar. So he was very close to Rabbi Sacks. And he wrote an article in an Israeli newspaper. And he was very bold in calling Rabbi Sacks a modern-day prophet. What is a prophet? A prophet is someone who is able to see a big picture and is able to warn us when we're veering in the wrong direction. And that's what you see in the AJC address. And it's quite incredible because it was 11 years ago, 2014, and he could have stood up today and said exactly the same thing.
But there is nonetheless a new anti-Semitism. Unlike the old, it isn't hatred of Jews for being a religion. It isn't hatred of Jews as a race. It is hatred of Jews as a sovereign nation in their own land. But it has taken and recycled all the old myths, from the blood libel to the protocols of the elders of Zion. Though I have to confess, as I said to the young leaders this morning, I have a very soft spot for anti-Semites because they say the nicest things about Jews. I just love the protocols of the elders of Zion. Because according to this, Jews control the banks, Jews control the media, Jews control the world. Little do they know we can't even control a shul board meeting.
So what's fascinating is if you look at his book, Future Tense, which was penned in 2009, the book itself is actually a book about anti-Semitism, and you'll note its title is very optimistic, Future Tense, because Rabbi Sacks truly, deeply believed, even though he understood exactly what anti-Semitism was, he believed that anti-Semitism shouldn't define us. Because if anti-Semitism defines who we are, we'll become the victims of external circumstances rather than the agents of change in the future. But he was very precise in his description of anti-Semitism. And the way in which he describes it has become I think it's actually become a prism through which many people use today. Some people don't even quote him. We were discussing it yesterday, Joanna. He called it a mutating virus. And he speaks about the idea that anti-Semitism is not new. And in every generation, it comes in different forms. But what it does is, like a virus, it attacks the immune system by mutating according to how the system is at the time. So, for example, today people say, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. But what Rabbi Sacks says is that throughout history, when people sought to justify their anti-Semitism, they did it by recourse to the highest source of authority within that culture. So, for example, in the Middle Ages, the highest recourse of authority was religion. So, obviously, we know the Christian pogroms and things that happened were this recourse to the fact, well, the Jews are not Christians and therefore we're justified in killing them. In the Enlightenment period, it was science. So we have the scientific study of race, right, and social Darwinism, which was used to predicate the Nazi ideology. Today, the highest value is, as we all know, human rights. And so the virus of anti-Semitism has mutated itself in order to look like a justification of human rights. If we don't challenge that, we are going to end up on the wrong side of history. And unfortunately, his prediction we are seeing come very much to light today.
I want to turn to a different topic. And this actually transitions well because, Tanya, you raised Prime Minister Tony Blair. Joanna, for our listeners who may have less familiarity with Rabbi Sacks, I would love for you to fill in a larger picture of Rabbi Sacks as one of the strongest global Jewish advocates of our time. He was a chief rabbi. His Torah knowledge, his philosophical works make him truly a religious and intellectual leader of our generation. At the same time, he was also counsel to the royal family, to secular thought leaders, world leaders. And in his remarks here at Global Forum, he actually raised addressing leading governing bodies at the European Union at that time, including Chancellor Merkel. These are not the halls that rabbis usually find themselves in. So I would love for you to explain to our audience, help us understand this part of Rabbi Sacks' life and what made him so effective in it.
Thanks, Meggie. Over the last couple of weeks, I spent quite a bit of time with people who have been interested in learning more about Rabbi Sacks and looking at his archive, which we've just housed at the National Library in Israel. Then I spent quite a significant amount of time with one of our Sacks scholars who's doing a project on exactly this. How did he live that Judaism engaged with the world that he wrote so eloquently about when he stepped down as chief rabbi? And a couple of days ago, I got an email actually sent to the Sacks scholar that I spent time with from the gifted archivist who's working on cataloguing Rabbi Sacks's archive. She brought our attention to a video that's on our website. Rabbi Sacks was asked by a young woman who was a student at Harvard doing a business leadership course, and she asked Rabbi Sacks for his help with her assignment. So he answered several questions, but the question that I wanted to bring to your attention was, what difference have you sought to make in the world? The difference that he sought to make in the world, and this is what he says, was to make Judaism speak to people who are in the world. Because it's quite easy being religious in a house of worship, in a synagogue, a church, or even actually at home or in the school. But when you're out there in the marketplace, how do you retain those strong values? And secondly, the challenge came from university. I was studying philosophy at a time when there were virtually no philosophers who were religious believers, or at least none who were prepared to publicly confess to that. So the intellectual challenges were real. So how do you make Judaism speak to people in those worlds? The world of academic life, the world of economy. And in the end, I realized that to do that credibly, I actually had to go into the world myself, whether it was broadcasting for the BBC or writing for the Times, and getting a little street cred in the world itself, which actually then broadened the mission. And I found myself being asked by politicians and people like that to advise them on their issues, which forced me to widen my boundaries. So from the very beginning, I was reminded that he wrote a piece, I don't know if you recall, but I think it was in 2005, maybe a little bit earlier. He wrote a piece for the Times about the two teenagers killed a young boy, Jamie Bulger. And he wrote a piece in the Times, and on the back of that, John Major, the Prime Minister at the time, called him in and asked him for his advice. Following that, he realised that he had something to offer. And what he would do is he would host dinners at home where he would bring key members of either the parliament or others in high positions to meet with members of the Jewish community. He would have one-on-one meetings with the Prime Minister of the time and others who would actually come and seek his advice and guidance. As Tanya reflected, he was extremely well read, but these were books that he read to help him gain a better understanding into the world that we're living in. He took his time around general elections to ring and make contact with those members of parliament that had got in to office from across the spectrum. So he wasn't party political. He spoke to everybody, and he worked really, really hard on those relationships. People would call him and say, so-and-so had a baby or a life cycle event, and he would make a point of calling and making contact with them. And you and I have discussed the personal effect that he had on people and building those relationships. So he didn't just do that within the Jewish community, but he really built up those relationships and broadened the horizons, making him a sought-after advisor to many. And we came across letters from the current king, from Prince Charles at the time, asking for his guidance on a speech, or asking Gordon Brown, inviting him to give him serious advice on how to craft a good speech, how long he should speak for. And Gordon Brown actually gave the inaugural annual lecture, memorial lecture for Rabbi Sacks last in 2023. And he said, I hope my mentor will be proud of me. Mm-hmm. And that gave us, it's emotional talking about it. But he really, really worked on himself. He realized he had something to offer. And he also worked on himself in making his ideas accessible to a broad audience. So many people could write and can speak. He had the ability to do both, but he worked on himself from quite a young age on making his speeches accessible. In the early days, they were academic and not accessible. Why have a good message if you can't share it with a broad audience?
What I also am thinking about, we're speaking, of course, here at an advocacy conference. And on the one hand, part of what you're describing are the foundations of being an excellent Jewish educator, having things be deeply accessible. But the other part that feels very relevant is being an excellent global Jewish advocate is engaging with people on all sides and understanding that we need to engage with whomever is currently in power or who may be in power in 4 years. And it again speaks to his foresight.
To your point about being prophetic, he was always looking 10, 15, 20 years ahead. He was never looking at tomorrow or next week. He was always, what are we doing now that can affect our future? How do I need to work to protect our Jewish community? He was focused, whilst he was chief rabbi, obviously on the UK, but he was thinking about the global issues that were going to impact the Jewish community worldwide.
Yeah. I want to turn to the antidotes that Rabbi Sacks proposed when he spoke here at Global Forum.
I will tell you the single most important thing we have to do. More important than all the others, we have to celebrate our Judaism. We have to have less oi and more joy. Do you know why Judaism survived? I'll tell you, because we never defined ourselves as victims, because we never lost our sense of humor, because never in all the centuries did we internalize the disdain of the world. Yes, our ancestors were sometimes hated by Gentiles, but they defined themselves as the people loved by God.
So he highlights the need to proudly embrace the particularism of Judaism, which really in today's world feels somewhat at odds with the very heavy reliance we have on universalism in Western society. And underpinning this, Rabbi Sacks calls on us to embrace the joy of Judaism, simchat ha'chaim, or as he so fittingly puts it, less oi and more joy. How did both of these shape Rabbi Sacks's wider philosophy and advocacy, and what do they mean for us today?
Rabbi Sacks speaks about the idea of human beings having a first and second language on a metaphorical level. A second language is our particularities. It's the family we're born into. It's where we learn who we are. It's what we would call today in sociology our thick identity, okay? It's who I am, what I believe in, where I'm going to, what my story is. But all of us as human beings also have a first language. And that first language, it can manifest itself in many different ways. First language can be a specific society, a specific nation, and it can also be my global humanity. My first language, though, I have to be able to speak my first language, but to speak my first language, meaning my universal identity, what we would call today thin identity, it won't work if I don't have a solid foundation in my thick identity, in my second language. I have nothing to offer my first language if I don't have a thick, particular identity. And Rabbi Sacks says even more than that. As Jews, we are here to teach the world the dignity of difference. And this was one of Rabbi Sacks's greatest messages. He has a book called The Dignity of Difference, which he wrote on the heels of 9/11. And he said that Judaism comes, and you have the whole story of Babel in the Bible, where the people try to create a society that is homogenous, right? The narrative begins, they were of one people and one language, and a oneness of things. Everyone was the same. And Rabbi Sacks says that God imposes diversity on them and then sees, can they still be unified even in their diversity? And they can't. So Rabbi Sacks answers that the kind of antidote to that is Abraham. Who is Abraham? Abraham, the Ivri. Ivri is me'ever, the other. Abraham, the legacy, the story of Abraham is to teach the world the dignity of difference. And one of the reasons we see anti-Semitism when it rears its head is when there is no tolerance for the other in society. There is no tolerance for the particular story, for my second language, for the way in which I am different to other people. There's no real space for diversity, even when we may use hashtags. Okay, or even when we may, proclaim that we are a very diverse society. When there is no space for the Jew, that's not true dignifying of difference. And so I think for Rabbi Sacks, he told someone once that he believed that one of his greatest novelties he brought into the world was the idea of Torah and Chokhmah, which is Torah and wisdom, universal wisdom. And Rabbi Sacks says that we need both. We need to have the particularity of our identity, of our language, of our literacy, of where we came from, of our belief system. But at the same time, we also need to have universal wisdom. And we have to constantly be oscillating and be kind of trying to navigate the space between these two things. And that's exactly what Rabbi Sacks did. And so I would say, I actually just finished with a beautiful story that he used to always tell. He would tell the story, and he heard the story from the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Schneerson, who was a very big influence on Rabbi Sacks and the leader of the Chabad movement. So in the story, there's two people that are schlepping rocks up a mountain, two workers. And one of them just sees his bags that are full of rocks and sees no meaning or purpose in his work. The other understands that he's carrying diamonds in his bag. And one day they get a different bag, and in that bag there's rubies. And the person who carries the rocks sees the rubies as rocks, again, sees it as a burden. But the person who's carrying the rubies and understands their value, even though they may not be diamonds, understands the values of the stones, will see them in a different way. The Lubavitcher Rebbe said, if we see our identity, our Judaism, as stones to carry, as a burden that we have to just schlep up a mountain, then we won't see anyone else's particular religion or particular belief system or particularity as anything to be dignified or to be valued. But if we see our religion as diamonds, we'll understand that other people's religions, though for me they may be rubies, they're still of value. You have to understand that your religion is diamonds, and you have to know what your religion is, understand what it is. You have to embrace your particularity. You have to engage with it, value it, and then go out into the world and advocate for it. And that, to me, was exactly what Rabbi Sacks did.
So much of what you're outlining is the underpinning of being a successful engager in interfaith and interreligious work. And Rabbi Sacks, of course, was such a leader there. In AJC, we have taken inspiration from Rabbi Sacks and have long engaged in interfaith and interreligious work. That's exactly a linchpin of it, preaching one's own faith in order to engage with others.
That's the oi and the joy. For Rabbi Sacks, it's exactly that. If I see it as the oi, which is schlepping it up the mountain, well, I'm not going to be a very good advocate. But if I see it as the joy, then my advocacy, it's like it shines through.
It's very interesting because he was interviewed by Christian Amanpour on CNN in 2014, just after he stepped down as chief rabbi. And she quoted the phrase, less oi, more joy, back to him. Referring to his description of the Jewish community when he came into office in 1991. He was worried about rising assimilation and outmarriage. And she said, how did you turn it around? He said, we've done the Book of Lamentations for many centuries. There's been a lot of anti-Semitism and a lot of negativity to Jewish identity. And if you think of yourself exactly as you're describing, as the people who get hated by others, or you've got something too heavy to carry, you're not going to want to hand that on to your children. If you've got a very open society, the question is, why should I be anything in particular? Being Jewish is a very particular kind of Jewish identity, but I do feel that our great religious traditions in Judaism is the classic instance of this. We have enormous gifts to offer in the 21st century, a very strong sense of community, very supportive families, a dedicated approach to education. And we do well with our children. We're a community that believes in giving. We're great givers, charitably and in other ways. So I think when you stay firm in an identity, it helps you locate yourself in a world that sometimes otherwise can be seen to be changing very fast and make people very anxious. I think when you're rooted in a people that comes through everything that fate and history can throw at it, and has kept surviving and kept being strong and kept going, there's a huge thing for young people to carry with them. And then he adds, to finish this interview, he said, I think that by being what we uniquely are, we contribute to humanity what only we can give. What Rabbi Sacks had was a deep sense of hope. He wore a yellow tie to give people hope and to make them smile. That's why he wore a yellow tie on major occasions. Sunshine, bringing hope and a smile to people's faces. And he had hope in humanity and in the Jewish people. And he was always looking to find the good in people and things. And when we talk about less oi and more joy, he took pleasure in the simple things in life, bringing music into the community as a way to uplift and bring the community together. We just spent a lovely Shabbat together with the AJC Shabbaton with the students. And he would have loved nothing more than being in shul and synagogue with the community and joining in.
Thank you, Joanna, and that's beautiful. I want to end our conversation by channeling how Rabbi Sacks concluded his 2014 address. He speaks about the need for Jewish unity at that time. Let's take a listen.
We must learn to overcome our differences and our divisions as Jews and work together as a global people. Friends, consider this extraordinary historical fact. Jews in history have been attacked by some of the greatest empires the world has ever known, empires that bestrode the narrow world like a colossus, that seemed invulnerable in their time. Egypt of the pharaohs, Assyria, Babylonia, the Alexandrian Empire, the Roman Empire, the medieval empires of Christianity and Islam, all the way up to the Third Reich and the Soviet Union. Each one of those seemingly invulnerable has been consigned to history, while our tiny people can still stand and sing Yisrael Chai.
In Rabbi Sacks's A Letter in the Scroll, he talks about the seminal moment in his life when he most deeply understood Jewish peoplehood and unity. And that was 1967, the Six-Day War, when the Jewish people, of course, witnessed the state of Israel on the brink of existential threat. To our AJC audience, this may ring particularly familiar because it was evoked in a piece by Michal Bichon, herself a Sacks scholar, a guest on our podcast, a guest, Tanya, on your podcast, who wrote a piece about a month after 10/7 titled "That Pain You're Feeling is Peoplehood." And that piece went viral in the Jewish world, and she draws this parallel between the moment that Rabbi Sacks highlights in 1967 and 10/7. I should note, Tanya, of course, is referenced in that article that Michal wrote. For our audiences, help us understand the centrality of peoplehood and unity to Rabbi Sacks' vision of Judaism. And as we now approach a year and a half past 10/7 and have seen the resurgence of certain communal fractures, what moral clarity can we take from Rabbi Sacks in this moment?
Okay, so it's interesting you talked about Michal, because I remember straight after 7/10, we were in constant conversation how it was impacting us, each of us in our own arenas in different ways. And one of the things I said to her, which I found really comforting, was that her constant ability to be in touch. And I think like this, you know, I like to call it after the name of a book that I read to my kid, The Invisible String. This idea that there is these invisible strings in the book. The mother tells the child that all the people we love have invisible strings that connect us. And when we pull on the string, they feel it the other side. 1967 was the moment Rabbi Sacks felt that invisible pull on the string. They have a very similar trajectory. The 7th of October was the moment in which many, many Jews who were perhaps disengaged, maybe a little bit ambivalent about their Jewish identity, they felt the tug of that invisible string. And then the question is, what do we do in order to maintain that connection? And I think for Rabbi Sacks, that was really the question. You know, he speaks about 1967 being the moment in which he says, I realized at that moment in Cambridge and everything was about choice and, you know, 1960s philosophy and Enlightenment philosophy. He says, but at that moment, I realized I hadn't chosen Judaism. Judaism had chosen me. And from that moment forth, Rabbi Sacks feels as if he had been chosen. Judaism had chosen him for a reason. He was a Jew for a reason. And I think today many, many Jews are coming back to that question. What does it mean that I felt that pull of the string on the 7th of October? And Rabbi Sacks' answer to that question of where do we go from here, I think very simply would be, to go back to the analogy, you need to work out why Judaism is a diamond. And once you understand why Judaism is a diamond and isn't a burden to carry on my back, everything else will fall into place, because you will want to advocate for that particularity and what that particularity brings to the world. In his book, Future Tense, which again was a book about anti-Semitism, there was a picture of a lighthouse at the front of the book. That's how Rabbi Sacks saw the antidote for anti-Semitism, right? That we need to be the lighthouse, because that's our role globally, to be able to be the light that directs the rest of the world when they don't know where they're going. And we are living in a time of dizziness at the moment on every level, morally, sociologically, psychologically. People are dizzy. And Judaism has, and I believe this is exactly what Rabbi Sacks advocated for, Judaism has a way to take us out of that maze that we found ourselves in. And so I think today more than ever, in response to your, yes, it is peoplehood that we feel. And then the question is, how do we take that feeling of peoplehood and use it towards really building what we need to do in this world, the advocacy that Judaism needs to bring into the world?
We all have a role, a reason, a purpose. When Rabbi Sacks spoke to us a decade ago, more than a decade ago at this point, those who were in the room felt the moral imperative to stand up, to advocate, and why as Jews we had that unique role. I am so honored that today now with Rabbi Sacks not here, you continue to give us that inspiration of why we are a letter in the scroll, why we must stand up and advocate. So thank you, Tanya and Joanna, for joining us at Global Forum and for this enlightening conversation.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
If you missed last week's episode, please be sure to listen as two AJC colleagues pay tribute to their friends Sarah Milgram and Yaron Lashinsky, who were brutally murdered outside the Capitol Jewish Museum in May. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.